Hi there, my name's Kate Clements. I'm curator at the Imperial War Museums. So early this year, IWM, that is the Imperial War Museums, launched a range of activity to mark the late Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II's Platinum Jubilee. As part of this, I wrote a book entitled The Royal Family in Wartime, which featured 50 photographs from IWM's collections, showing the links between the royal family and the armed forces from the First World War to the present day. I also curated a photography exhibition at the museum's London site, as well as an object trail there which guides visitors through the museum via highlighted objects that have a link to royalty and wartime. And I'm going to talk to you today about some of that content, and also, of course, about the late Queen's experiences during the Second World War. The photo exhibition, which is called Crown and Conflict, and is open until January next year, features 20 photographs of the Queen during wartime and also during her reign, showing her strong links with the armed forces. It's broken up into several sections that are broadly chronological, but also cover different themes. I should say that since the sad passing of Her Majesty the Queen, the museum has updated its public displays about the Jubilee by adding messaging to reflect that. The first section of photographs in the display looks at how the Queen, or Princess Elizabeth as she was then, grew up in wartime. The Princess was just 13 years old when the war broke out, and her younger sister Princess Margaret was just 9. Their parents, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, were very involved with the nation's war effort, right from the outbreak of war. The King gave a radio address to Britain and its then empire in September 1939, in which he talked of the difficult times ahead, but encouraged people to stand firm. Princess Elizabeth had a fairly sheltered childhood prior to the war. She didn't attend school with other children, but was instead educated at home with her sister by a governess. When war broke out, Elizabeth and Margaret were evacuated to Windsor Castle, as it was felt to be safer than Buckingham Palace in London. And there they were kept safe from the bombing, and also had an allotment which they kept as part of the National Dig for Victory campaign. They also performed in and helped to stage a series of Christmas pantomimes to raise money for the Royal Household Wool Fund, which supplied knitting wool to make comforters for soldiers fighting at the front. Princess Elizabeth carried out her first public duties during the war. So in October 1940, she made a radio broadcast on BBC Radio to the children of the Commonwealth who had been evacuated. In this, she encouraged them to be strong and assured them that peace would come. She also took on some honorary roles when she was still a teenager. So she became the Colonel of the Grenadier Guards in 1942, and on her 16th birthday, she carried out her first official public engagement when she inspected the guards at Windsor Castle. Princess Elizabeth also launched her first ship, HMS Vanguard, at Clydebank in Scotland when she was aged 18. And she even performed some of her father the King's head of state duties while he was in Italy in 1944. The Princess really grew up during these years, and they were of course very dark and difficult times for Britain and its empire. She was naturally very responsible and dutiful, and very much took notice of what was happening and wanted to play her part. She saw the work her parents were doing to boost people's morale, and she learned from that the importance of duty and the role of monarchy. Princess Elizabeth was keen to contribute to the war effort and to do her bit, as so many of her contemporaries were. Her father, the King, was reluctant for his daughter to join any of the organisations that women could serve in. However, the Princess was set on joining up and enlisted in the Auxiliary Territorial Service, that's the ATS, in February 1945. The ATS was an auxiliary service that women could join or be conscripted into during the war. Its members became women soldiers who carried out roles that would free up men for frontline duties. Women were not allowed combat roles, so instead they served as telephonists or clerks, drivers, postal workers, dispatch riders, ammunition inspectors, and many more besides. Around 56,000 members of the ATS also served with anti-aircraft units, in which they tracked enemy aircraft and aimed anti-aircraft guns, but only men were allowed to fire them. Princess Elizabeth joined the ATS shortly before her 19th birthday and trained as a mechanic and truck driver. She was known as Second Subaltern Elizabeth Windsor and was part of No. 1 Beaufort Company. She graduated as a fully qualified driver, but the war ended before she was able to make practical use of her new skills. She learned how to service, maintain and drive heavy army vehicles at the ATS No. 1 Mechanical Transport Training Centre. She enrolled on a driving and vehicle maintenance course. Her classes included mechanics theory and map reading. The Princess was mostly treated the same as the rest of her company during their training and was able to mix with young people from different backgrounds. Although she did return to Windsor Castle each night rather than stay with her fellow ATS members at their camp. But this was still a new and enjoyable experience for her, and she liked chatting with other women on her course over cups of tea during their breaks. Although Princess Elizabeth joined the ATS in February 1945, so quite close to the end of the war in Europe, there was still at the time a lot of heavy fighting by the British Empire and Allied forces, both in their drive towards Germany and in the Pacific theatre against the Japanese. Also, the V-weapon attacks were still happening, so having the heir to the throne join the war effort at that time was an important way to show that there was still a need to keep fighting, to keep going, and that the royal family was involved in that fight. It was really valuable in that it boosted morale. There was great press interest in seeing the young heir to the throne during her military training. Photographers captured her dressed in overalls, working on vehicle engines and changing tyres, and the press even named her Princess Auto Mechanic. So, as well as raising the princess's profile, people were now seeing her as an adult member of the royal family. She turned 19 in April 1945, and being so publicly part of the war effort, being shown during training and clearly taking her role seriously, it demonstrated to people that she was a young woman who understood the part she had to play in the nation and who took her responsibilities seriously. In terms of her contribution to the war actively, it ended before she was able to put her new skills to use. So she completed her training and graduated as a fully qualified driver, but the war ended in May and she wasn't deployed. But the very fact that she had joined up and done her bit, I think helped to keep people's morale up, and people saw her in a positive light because of it. The Princess enlisting in the ATS also did a great deal to endear her to other members of that service, and many said how proud they felt to be serving in the same organisation as the future Queen. During the war, huge numbers of women volunteered or were conscripted into war work. The conscription of unmarried women between ages 20 to 30 was introduced in Britain in December 1941. Women could choose between working on the land or in war industry, or joining one of the military auxiliary services. Later on, the age limits expanded and even more women were mobilised. The ATS was the largest of the women's auxiliary services, and by June 1945 it had around 200,000 members who were drawn from across the British Empire. Initially, women from the West Indies were not permitted to join the ATS, but in 1943 the War Office relented and allowed their recruitment, and in total around 300 women from the West Indies served in the ATS. At one point during her training, Princess Elizabeth's family visited her. She later commented that she hadn't known how much effort went into a royal visit, but that she would know for the future. Photos and some film captured her working to complete her course. She later told a friend, "I never worked so hard in my life, but I enjoyed it very much." As part of her final test, which she passed, she made a solo journey in a heavy vehicle from Camberley in Surrey into London. And by the end of the war, she was a junior commander. Against the backdrop of a country at war, Princess Elizabeth also learned from her parents about the importance of duty during times of national crisis. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth made numerous royal visits to troops, munitions factories and bombed-out areas. As heir to the throne, Princess Elizabeth often accompanied them on these morale-boosting visits. For example, they all visited RAF bomber crews who had just returned from operations in northern France in 1944. They paid a farewell visit to HMS King George V in October 1944, just before the battleship left to join operations in the Pacific. They met members of the 306th Bomb Group of the United States Army Air Forces at their base at Thurley in Bedfordshire, where the Princess christened an aircraft named Rose of York in her honour. And in May 1944, the family group made a tour of airborne forces as they trained and prepared for the forthcoming Allied invasion of Normandy. During the war, the King and Queen ensured that they were really visible for the people of Britain, and they took on the role of boosting the morale of people who were working and fighting for the war effort. They visited serving personnel and munitions factories, RAF bases and Royal Naval ships, and troops training, and areas that had been bombed. This all helped to keep people's spirits up during the challenges of the war years. They saw that their King and Queen weren't hiding away from danger, but they were there with them to encourage them to keep going. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth famously remained at Buckingham Palace during the Blitz, even after it was bombed. The Blitz on Britain lasted for 9 months, killed more than 40,000 people, and damaged 2 million homes. In September 1940, the palace was damaged during a German air raid. One member of palace staff was killed during the bombing, and afterwards Queen Elizabeth, who is later of course known as the Queen Mother, wrote that the bombs exploded with a tremendous crash in the quadrangle. And it was quite an important moment when they chose to stay in London, and I think that shows how, just as in the First World War, which I'll explain later, the royal family understood its role and duty to stand with the British people, to boost morale, and to show that they were in the fight with the nation. And I think this endeared people to the King and Queen during the war. Their daughter Princess Elizabeth saw that as she accompanied them on the visits, and that element of service and duty that characterised her subsequent reign was, I think, in large part learned during wartime. On VE Day, 8th of May 1945, Princess Elizabeth joined her parents and sister on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, along with the Prime Minister Winston Churchill, to greet the huge cheering crowds that had gathered there to celebrate the end of the war in Europe. The King and Queen made 8 public balcony appearances, cheered by the crowds. And later on the day, the young princess and her sister were allowed to leave the palace and mingle with the crowds anonymously. Princess Elizabeth later recalled, "We stood outside and shouted, 'We want the King,' and she said it was one of the most memorable nights of her life." A few years after the end of the war, Princess Elizabeth, now a wife and mother, sadly lost her father and found out that she was the new monarch while she was making an overseas visit. Winston Churchill was the Queen's first Prime Minister. He was serving his second term as Britain's leader when she became Queen in 1952. As a young princess during the war, Elizabeth saw her father, the King, enjoy a close relationship with Churchill, and she, as heir to the throne, gradually spent more time with the wartime leader, who was very fond of her and even sent her roses for her 15th birthday. Churchill also gave advice and guidance to the Queen in the early years of her reign, and the two had an enduring friendship. When asked which of her prime ministers she enjoyed meeting the most, the Queen replied, "Winston, of course, because it was always such fun." In 2005, the Queen opened IWM's Churchill Museum at the Cabinet War Rooms in central London. During her opening speech, she paid tribute to Churchill, praising the unique quality of his leadership. The Second World War was a really important part of the Queen's life. She really grew up in wartime, and her experiences then shaped the monarch she became. So throughout her reign, she supported members of the armed forces, veterans of conflict, and the families of those who serve, and was very visibly present at moments when the nation was at war, and also every year when the nation paused to remember those who died in war, and I think she took that part of her role very seriously. Queen Elizabeth was naturally quite serious and responsible, even when she was young, and the war years really strengthened that aspect of her personality and provided the foundation of her later attitude towards duty when she became monarch. She learned from her father the importance of the monarch being visible and present during times of national crisis. The war also impacted her relationship with the armed services, having joined them herself and met with so many of those who served in the war. She also passed these ideas and values on to her children and grandchildren, many of whom carried on the tradition of royal military service and working with veterans. Visiting the families of veterans and serving personnel has for a long time been an important role for the royal family. It's all part of how much they support the armed forces during war and during peacetime. They understand how much sacrifice is needed to serve, and that the families of those who do so really welcome support and acknowledgement. And you can see in something like the institution of the Elizabeth Cross in 2009 by the Queen as being really key to this, because it was a medal for the families of those killed in military service. The Queen said at the time when it was introduced, how the medal would reflect the nation's debt of gratitude, and that those who died for their country should all be remembered. As head of the armed forces, the Queen held many military appointments and was closely associated with British and Commonwealth service personnel. Throughout her reign, the Queen paid many visits to military bases, training establishments, and similar sites. She also spent time with service personnel and their families, both in Britain and abroad. Every year, the Queen attended the Trooping the Colour ceremony at Horse Guards Parade in London, an annual event to mark her official birthday. This large-scale display of military precision involves more than 1,400 soldiers and 200 horses, and closes with an RAF flypast. The royal family has a long-standing connection to the Victoria Cross, or VC, founded by Queen Victoria in 1856, as well as the George Cross, GC, founded by the Queen's father, King George VI, in 1940. Both decorations reward extreme acts of bravery. The Queen was closely involved with the VC and GC association and would attend Thanksgiving services and host its members at their gatherings. In 2005, the Queen awarded Lance Corporal Johnson Bahari with the VC for extreme bravery shown in Iraq. At the time, she told him, "You're a very special person. It's been rather a long time since I've awarded one of these." The Queen, of course, started her married life as the wife of a Royal Naval officer. Other members of her family have also served in the military. Her grandson, Prince Harry, fought in the war in Afghanistan in 2007 and 2012. Prince Philip also served with great distinction during the Second World War. He fought in the Battle of Cape Matapan, served in convoys, and took part in the Allied landings in Sicily in July 1943. But after the Princess became Queen in 1952, Prince Philip left the Royal Navy with the rank of Commander to take up royal duties. These close bonds between royalty and military service are very clearly shown each year in November, when the nation pauses to remember. The Queen led the nation in its commemoration of British and Commonwealth service personnel who have died in conflict since 1914, during the service of remembrance at the Cenotaph in London each year. This was a role that was very important to her. So this all demonstrates how the monarchy and the armed forces are very closely intertwined, and how the Second World War had a lasting impact on the young princess who joined up while it was being fought. And I want to talk now a little about the wider history of the links between royalty and wartime. The British royal family has a long-standing and close association with the British Armed Forces, and has played a key role in times of war and conflict. This has included not only personal service in the military and boosting national morale, but also, as I've said, continuing work in peacetime to support veterans and commemorate those who've served. Both Edward, Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VIII, and his brother Prince Albert, the future King George VI, served during the First World War. Edward joined the army, but, as heir to the throne, was not permitted to fight, and instead served as a staff officer. Although this disappointed him, his wartime service still gave him a greater understanding of ordinary men. The prince later wrote of his memories of the war, "I have only to close my eyes to see once more those awful charred battlefields." His brother Prince Albert joined the Royal Navy before the war and took part in the Battle of Jutland in 1916, the only major naval action between the British and German fleets of the First World War. He served aboard HMS Collingwood and later described the battle, saying, "I was sitting at the top of A turret. A German ship started firing at us, and one salvo straddled us. We at once returned the fire. I was distinctly startled and jumped down the hole in the top of the turret like a shot rabbit." The prince's sister, Princess Mary, also did her part for the war effort. She trained and worked as a nurse, and also started a fund to buy a Christmas gift for every British serviceman. By the time the fund closed in 1920, more than £160,000 had been donated to it. The tins contained different items for smokers and non-smokers, and all included a Christmas card from the royal family. During the First World War, King George V changed the family's Germanic surname to Windsor. This move can be seen in light of the anti-German sentiment that was in Britain at the time. There were instances of German-owned shops and businesses being vandalised, and people with Germanic names or backgrounds being mistreated. So it was felt to be a good idea for the royal family to distance itself from its past German links, and so adopt this new surname. King George V and Queen Mary made hundreds of visits to munitions factories, hospitals, shipyards, etc., and the king also made visits to the front and boosted the morale of his troops. The royal family also played a prominent role in post-war national commemorations of those who were killed. The king unveiled the focal point for a commemoration in London, the Cenotaph, in 1920, which was designed by Sir Edwin Lutyens. The king recorded in his diary that day that the whole ceremony was most moving and impressive. When the Second World War broke out, the royal family carried out similar duties in a bid to boost public morale and the war effort, as I've said already. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, of course, visited home defence forces and air bases and other sites, and the king went overseas to inspect troops. During the German air raids of the Blitz, Buckingham Palace was hit, and this prompted Queen Elizabeth to state, "I am glad we have been bombed. Now we can look the East End in the eye." Their daughter joined the auxiliary territorial service, as I've spoken about already, and then married Prince Philip after the war, who also served in it. Their wedding was a bright moment in the days of post-war austerity and helped boost the spirits of a nation. Their children and grandchildren carried on the tradition of royal military service and working with veterans. The Prince of Wales, now King Charles, served in the Royal Navy and RAF, and both of his sons graduated from the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. Prince William served as an officer in the army before training as an RAF search and rescue pilot. He then spent 3 years working for this service, later becoming an air ambulance pilot, providing emergency response. Prince Harry was secretly deployed to Afghanistan in December 2007, where he had a frontline role providing air cover for British troops in Helmand province. However, he had to return after 10 weeks when his presence there was made public. After qualifying as a helicopter pilot in 2011, he was sent to Afghanistan again for a second tour the following year. During this 5-month tour of duty, the Prince flew Apache helicopters on missions which saw him fire at Taliban fighters in support of ground troops. I hope you have enjoyed hearing about the history of the royal family and wartime, and seeing just how strong the association between royalty and the armed forces is, and has been. Wars are moments of national crisis, and the royal family has always been a constant presence during such times. And by being visible, by visiting people involved in the war effort, by serving in the armed forces themselves, they are showing up and keeping people's spirits up during dark times. From the First World War up until more recent conflicts, we can see this close bond between the crown and conflict, and understand why it is so enduring. And you can learn more about many of the events and themes I've talked about at Imperial War Museums. We have 5 different branches and a wealth of historical information and objects from our vast collections, all available to find on our website at iwm.org.uk. Thank you very much for listening.